Well, welcome everybody to our December climate webinar, Advent, Climate and Nonviolent Action, Igniting Fire in Our Bones. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with a quick climate update. Just a reminder of some of the headlines you've probably seen in the news this past week. Climate change increases the odds of heat waves and can make them more intense. This past week, Taylor Swift was on a concert tour in Brazil during a brutal heat wave. Temperatures in Rio climbed to 93 degrees Fahrenheit with a reported record-breaking heat index, or feels like temperature, of 138 degrees Fahrenheit. The effects of Friday's heat caused some fans attending Swift's concert to pass out. And Ana Clara Benavides Machado, a 23-year-old fan, died of the heat while waiting for Swift's concert to begin in Sao Paulo. This week, Arctic air sweeping across warmer Great Lakes brought snow to the northeastern U.S. Nearly 2.5 feet of snow fell in 24 hours in New York State, and multiple vehicle crashes occurred across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. On the morning of November 27th, 2023, colossal waves from Storm Sirius surged ashore in Sochi, Russia, wreaking havoc on coastal infrastructure, inundating hotels and apartments and flooding ground floors. Russia's at a distance, but here in the United States, we have nearly 40% of the population who live in coastal counties. It means millions of people will be impacted by sea level rise and severe storms. Coastal erosion and coastal infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and water supplies are at risk. Some communities are projected to be at or below sea level by 2100 and will face decisions around managed retreat and climate adaptation. However, there is good news. Good news! Some of the world's largest fossil fuel companies on Saturday signed a pledge to reduce methane emissions to near zero by 2030, a self-imposed target that would mark a major step in pollution reduction if the companies can follow through. The decision is controversial because they're focusing on only one arm of the problem, methane, and they need to also focus on fossil fuel gas. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas that's responsible for 1/4 of the world's warming and would make the most impact if it were curbed. Separately, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced at a news conference new rules for reducing oil and gas-related methane emissions domestically. Good news! Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry enlisted high school-aged teens to act as advocates for building the city's resilience to the impacts and consequences of global climate change. Good news! Reefs in the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico are truly thriving around 100 miles off the Texas coast. After years of reports that coral around the world is dying, news that a reef is not just surviving, but covering 50% of the sanctuary compared to 10% in other regions, that news has delighted scientists. So, more good news? Today we will be continuing the theme for this cycle through June 2024, which is Climate Action, Restoring Right Relationships. As you can see from the news, our relationship with the Earth is out of balance and the need for restoration is urgent. But around the world, there are signs of hope and people are taking action. We have only a small window of opportunity to restore right relationships with all of creation. and move toward building God's preferred future, the new creation Jesus preached and modeled. Today, we will explore the theological background for Christian involvement in nonviolent, direct action for justice. Advent's the perfect time to explore our biblical roots for advocacy and speaking truth to power out of a context of weakness. And we have the perfect presenters with us today to share their knowledge from both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. During these presentations, please put questions in the chat box directed to Dean White or to everyone. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Fellows from Great Britain, a member of our climate team, who's been active in protests speaking truth to power. He will share some background and introduce our guests for us. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Susan. In a moment, I will introduce our two presenters, Mike and Rachie, from Christian Climate Action. But let's get some history about how we arrived at this point. In the summer of 2019, I remember watching the news and it featured a big pink boat in the centre of London, blocking traffic and being the focus of a group called Extinction Rebellion, who I'm going to refer to as XR, who occupied the centre of London for many days and was instrumental in the British government's declaring a climate emergency. This started a ripple effect that resulted in other governments following suit. But most importantly for me, it changed the conversation. And I, like many others, started on the road to understanding what the impacts of global warming might be and its cause, the burning of fossil fuels. Personally, I was alarmed at the actions of XR and felt they were far too extreme for the likes of me. That summer, I attended Greenbelt, a Christian festival of music, arts and seminar. And I was there to support Community Christ Sings. I had noticed an organisation with a similar logo to XR, the now familiar circle representing the earth, and an hourglass within representing that time is running out. But there was also a crucifix, also a crucifix at the top. This was Christian Climate Action, who I'll be referring to as CCA. This was a burning bush moment for me. It stopped me in my tracks and set me on a new route. Later that year, I joined XR and CCA to protest in London and block roads. I nervously took my place carrying the banner and stepped out into the traffic. On returning home to my congregation in Claycross, Derbyshire, a friend of mine, Michael Clark, who's on tonight, was especially interested, and together we joined other protests with the CTA, including rebellions through the pandemic, HS2, which is a railway for the rich, and COP26 in Glasgow. Although we consider ourselves non-arrestable, you see, you can choose not to be arrested by being aware of the police and, once warned, stepping off the road. We were able to support CCA with arrestee support, which is ensuring those arrested are treated well by leafleting, engaging the public, and in prayer visuals. Michael recorded our action through his art, becoming known as Michael the Artist. Michael and I discovered your webinars and have enjoyed the journey in taking part, even if these are held around bedtime in the British Isles. Inspired by these experiences, at the end of 2020, the British Isles Mission Centre declared a climate emergency, and I was encouraged to propose a World Church resolution. At World Church this year, I spoke to the resolution to declare a climate emergency, and this we now refer to as World Conference Resolution 1325. I enjoyed spending time with the North American climate justice team, who have seemingly adopted me. In the summer of this year, I returned to Greenbelt with CCA with the hope that I would find organisations that would be prepared to present at our webinars. and it seemed natural to ask CCA, who suggested that I talk to Mike and Rachie. Our World Church Resolution 1325 not only declares a climate emergency and challenges us all at every jurisdiction to reduce our impact on global warming by reducing our carbon footprints, it goes further. In the third point of the second resolve, it says, support those organisations and community groups that peaceably raise awareness of climate change and or peacefully take action to limit global warming. The resolution, therefore, calls for us to support those organisations and community groups that raise awareness of climate change and peacefully take action, often against powerful people, governments, media, and companies, all on our behalf. And so here we are. We are blessed that Mike and Rachie are available to talk to us today. Mike Mullins is a leadership coach and spiritual retreat facilitator. He has witnessed the tragic destruction of much wildlife across the British Isles, to the point where the UK has become one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. Living in London now, everywhere he looks, he sees people yearning for that lost connection to nature. The loss of biodiversity and the existential threat of climate change led Mike to get involved in climate change activism, Christian Climate Action, XR, Just Stop Oil, and the rewilding movement. Rewilding is the process to return land and habitat back to its uncultivated state and reintroduce species that have been driven out or decimated. For Mike, the key to rewilding the earth, to reversing biodiversity loss and the effects of climate change is a spiritual challenge. Rachie is an active member of Christian Climate Action and a trustee of Operation Noah. She is a theologian and therapeutic coach and has served as a church elder and young people's worker for over 25 years. She is motivated by the biblical mandate for non-violent direct action and aims to put a fire in our bellies and theological tools in our hands. So, Mike will lead us in a short visualization to set the scene and hand over to Rachie. There will be a short break after Rachie to catch your breath, take in what you've heard, and perhaps post a question in the chat. Mike's presentation will follow, after which there will be some time for questions. So, Mike, it's over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Lovely to meet you all. I was going to say this evening, but it's probably midday for you. So, yeah, lovely to see you all. I'm gonna do a visualization as a form of prayer to start today's talk. So I'm going to invite you to make yourselves comfortable. So if you want to place your feet firmly on the ground and maybe sit upright so you're alert but comfortable. And then if you're comfortable doing so, I'm just going to invite you just to close your eyes and just listen as I walk you through this visualization. So in your mind's eye, imagine that you're back in Jerusalem, 30 AD. It's the Jewish month of Nisan, the month of Pesach, of Passover. And you're a poor Jew with a big family, a Jew that loves God and wants to show your love for God by sacrificing a pigeon at the temple. A pigeon is all you can afford. But the temple authorities won't accept your money because it has Caesar's head on it. So you're forced to change your money for shekels in the outer courtyard of the temple. But the exchange rate is extortionate, costing you a month's wages just to buy one pigeon to sacrifice to your Lord. So worshipping at the temple for people like you, for the poor, is crippling. You can see how the priestly caste and the aristocrats, collaborating with the Romans, are making so much money out of their control of the temple. This causes you a deep sense of resentment. And as you're changing your money, out of the corner of your eye, you see Yeshua ben Joseph, that preacher from the Galilee. And suddenly he starts turning over the tables of the money changers, pushing out the sellers of the pigeons, crying, "You have turned my father's house into a den of thieves." There's a beautiful passion, a righteous anger about him. The sellers, the money changers flee him. Money, goods, animals are scattered all across the court of the temple. And you and the other poor Jews smile and applaud and cheer. At last, someone is speaking up for us. Someone has the moral courage to speak truth to power and call out the greed, the exploitation. But your heart, whilst full of joy, is also filled with fear for Yeshua. How will this system hit back and exact his revenge on him? So in your own time, if you want to open your eyes, come back into the room. And I'm going to pass over to Rachie.
Thanks, Mike, so much. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to your meeting. Thank you for having us. And what great timing in the middle of COP28. And I feel very honored to be with you. I know Mike and I both do, and we're inspired by what you're seeking to be in these days. Now, we know that climate breakdown is a justice issue and it's deeply unfair. Mike's just extrapolated that. And the poor and least polluting suffer worst. They always do. And you have recently declared a climate emergency, for which I applaud you. But governments are failing to act enough. We heard that earlier. So it's up to us to make noise and to take stands. So what does the Bible have to say about civil disobedience and non-violent direct action? So, well, the pages of the Bible are full of people who stood up to injustice, and they show us a blueprint for what God is pleased with in this space. There's an old tale about a rabbi and a boy. And the lad asks the rabbi, why in Deuteronomy 6:6 it says this, "These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts." Why, he says, are God's commandments not to be in our hearts? And the rabbi says this, "It is because at some point in life, the heart will be cracked open and the truth will drop inside." So I really pray tonight, well, actually tonight for me and Mike, but today for you guys, that the truth about what we're going to look at will kind of just drop in. The truth about the planet, living differently, caring for those that suffer, drops in and changes us because it does matter to God. So I'm going to take us through some narrative theology where we try to get inside the shoes of the people in the passage. They were real people facing real challenges. But I really want you to enjoy the narrative as well. Okay, Jesus was a Jew. He grew up on these Old Testament studies of how God dealt with his people and their friendship with his father. So Today's passages would have been Jesus' bread and butter. Now, I only have 20 minutes, but I want to try and give you a ready-to-grab story from the Old Testament to get under our skin. And the Old Testament is stuffed full of amazing women and men of action and faith, but I've chosen to focus on some subversive women because God places them center stage, so I thought we'd roll with that. So literally open the Bible at the second book, Exodus 1 and 2, and we're introduced to 5 powerful women who resist evil, stand up for the vulnerable, and change history. And it is arguably the first example of non-violent direct action in the Bible. And I guess you're probably over familiar with the story, so I really, really applaud you to try and step back a little bit, please, as we go through. So first up, we meet 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who were told by the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, who is full of fear, by the way, to kill the Hebrew baby boys at birth. And Jewish scholars say they're most probably Egyptian women because therefore they're midwives to the Hebrews, not Hebrew midwives. Why do I say this? Because Jewish scholars have an ancient list of 20 non-Jewish pious women, and Shiphrah and Puah are listed on that list. And it does make sense, okay, that Pharaoh would have trusted his own people. It always kind of struck me as slightly odd that Hebrew midwives would be trusted. But anyway, whatever happens, these 2 women overcome their circumstances and upbringing to do what is right. They show the power of the individual to overcome societal evil, to actively resist evil, not shirking their own responsibilities under the guise of some kind of superior order from a tyrant for them nonetheless. And they blow apart, uncomfortably actually, our excuses of cultural norms and the pressures we live under. And they are a shining example that it is possible to rise above. It is within our grasp. They had no one to ask advice from, but they don't follow the order. They were clever, they were cunning, they were cool. They simply don't play ball. And it says in the passage that God sees their bravery and honors them. Now, these midwives worked together as a pair. They definitely had a coordinated approach, a united response. They say this, I'm so sorry, these Hebrew boys, they come so fast, we never get there. It's a massively risky strategy. They hatched a plan, no doubt, together. They put their own lives in danger if they'd been found out. They risked it all to save lives, and lives that they don't know and weren't, inverted commas, their people. It is deeply impressive. They were risking their lives potentially for unborn slaves, and you don't get much more marginalized than an unborn slave. It also makes it very clear they lied and God loved it. So they saved the lives of the unborn and future generations, and it's quite likely Moses was maybe delivered by them, saving him from this first round of deaths. Who knows? Questions to ponder at this point. Do I need a buddy to help us live out our best and make changes and hold our nerves? So I would encourage you, find role models in the justice movement that you admire. Read, meditate, pray, copy, emulate them so they can spur you on to good works. So as you think about living more deeply sustainably, have a friend who's committed to it as well. So if you make changes to your diet, for example, change with a friend. It's much more useful that way. And as a family, when we went plant-based about 10 years ago, we had several families in our community who also went plant-based, massively helpful. And when we stopped flying 18 years ago, we found several others who also joined that dot, and they don't fly either. And it really, really helps. The second question to ponder from these 2 women is, are we prepared to protect the unborn next generation? So maybe some of the babies they saved were ancestors of famous Hebrews and later Israelites. We don't know. They didn't know. They had no idea if they were saving fabulous boys or later bullies, but they played their part in doing the right thing at the time they were living in. And we need to let our sacred imaginations wander forward to the lives we hope to save, who have not been born yet. We need to look back and we need to look forward like Shiphrah and Puah. And are we prepared to use our professions for greater good? They used the skills they had. So what can we make with our hands? What can we bring to life in these days? The challenge is that all of our lives are sacred and all of our lives need to be aligned to act justly. So how we earn our living, well, that has to be brought in line as well. So my challenge is to keep an eye on all of it, to integrate all of our lives. So social media posts, for example, I see a lot of this with people I follow, friends of mine who kind of celebrate fast travel or fast fashion or fast food, but haven't joined that disconnect. So just be mindful of our influence. And then next up, we meet Moses' mum, Jochebed. She's an outstanding woman. She chose to refuse to despair. This was her nonviolent direct action. She chose to refuse to despair. And she was living in a time of extreme ethnic cleansing. There was blood and screams in the community huts, baby boys ripped from her friends' arms by Egyptian army, lobbed into the River Nile as an offering to the river god. And the Hebrew slave community would have brought the babies up together with a corporate sense of love and responsibility. And it's into that mess that she gives birth to her third child, the little baby boy, Moses. What on earth is she to do? Did she ask Amram's opinion? That's her husband. We don't know. Did she despair and freak out? Well, no, she didn't. Should she try and hide Moses or bargain with the soldiers or beg to kill him herself? Maybe then at least she'd know where his dead body was. She had some hideous choices, and you kind of can't blame her if she panicked. But she doesn't. She refuses to give her son, who is a gift of life from God, regime, held her nerve. She took matters into her own hands. And despite the tiny, tiny chance that she would succeed, she took control. Now, you'll be familiar with Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz. And he says taking control is crucial, no matter how tiny the control we feel we have. And when he was beaten, he refused to scream for a count of several seconds, whereas the others screamed straight away, and it bought him some sanity. So he refused to give his liberty away, and he screamed when he chose, not before. So Moses' mum kept her freedom to choose life, no matter that life may have been taken from Moses within minutes of her putting her plan in motion. She was taking the little bit of control she had, and she gave him over to God in prayer and trust. She also disobeyed orders from above her, which I love, from her financial and societal superior. He was her boss, if you like. It was the king. And she kind of doesn't wait for God to say, oh, look, resist, because she knows God's heart. And we know God's heart. God's heart is for the poor, the defenseless, and again, not much more defenseless than a newborn baby boy. She made a coffin. I can't imagine the human sorrow or fear that would have threatened to overwhelm her. Her best chance, actually, was that a traveling nomad may see Moses and pick him up and then take him away forever to a foreign land. And that was the best that she could humanly hope for. Anyhow, she feeds him, she kisses him, and then she wades across the river to the enemy side, and she pops his floating coffin in the river on the far shore. Then she wades back again, and she leaves to stop suspicion spreading. And she places a burden on the shoulders of her little girl, Miriam, we know, to keep watch. This is because Miriam could play in the river and paddle and not look suspicious. So Jochebed's resistance was that she held her nerve. She did the right thing, and then she left the rest in God's hands. We know the end of the story, but she did not. George Monbiot, the environmental justice journalist, says that Christians are right that despair is a sin because it leads to inaction and inability to move forward. So Jochebed says no to despair, and she keeps things moving forward. I acknowledge this episode is not without its challenges around the death of the other babies, but what is clear is her refusal to despair and her purposeful action. It's worth sitting in Jochebed's shoes later on after tonight and letting the enormity of her situation sink in. Don't rush past her vignette because it's full of nourishment. Then next up, we have Pharaoh's daughter Bithia for her daily wash in the river. No doubt at a time that Daddy has cleared the babies from the river, the dead ones, that would have been gross. So we see her enter, and Miriam sees her enter, and her heart must have leapt out of her chest. So Bithia spots the floating basket wedged into the reeds, and she has it brought to her by her servant girl. And we see her look in, and she sees a baby. Now, poor Miriam, I guess it was going from bad to worse here, right? Bithia is the daughter of this maniac who's turning the River Nile red with blood. Now, surely Moses will be yanked by his feet and thrown and drowned after all. Bithia may not have known actually what her father was doing, but she surely does know these Hebrews are oppressed slaves because their slave song that was sung at night around the fire would have travelled into her quarters, and now the wailing and crying of the cull has caused the same reaction. But she doesn't see an issue in the basket, but rather she sees a human being, a real flesh and blood baby, and she refuses to follow a societal norm. She's royalty, and here's a slave baby. Think about it for a minute. She sees a baby and she chooses from the heart, not the head, to do the right thing. She coos over him. She's resolute, and she refuses to see Moses as a problem to be ignored. And we know that she brought him into the palace in full view of the Hebrews and some of the Egyptians, even if she hid it from some of the others. And at this moment, she's not a racist. And this is remarkable, okay? Because her heart was open to Moses, to the other. And she refused, like Jochebed, to do evil whenever she had any choice about it. She had no power to change wider plans, but she took responsibility for what choices presented themselves to her, however seemingly insignificant. And I take great sustenance from that. She made choices that were presented to her, however seemingly insignificant. And here are some challenges to reflect on. And I think in all of our churches, we need to think about what Bithia's challenges are. Do we listen more to our inherited traditions than what is morally right? Do we challenge injustice in our families and churches, such as the pension funds we're linked to, banks, methods of travel, consumption of resources? And do we understand that to say that we can't change the system is no excuse for not doing what we can in front of our own faces? And what I love is help comes from the opposite camp, so the enemy. And Bithia was the last person, apart from Pharaoh, that had wanted to pick up Moses because he took him right inside the danger zone. And again, do we believe God can use those opposed to us? Do we? In Britain, it's difficult with our divisional politics. Sure, in Canada and the States, it's probably the same. Do we believe good can come out of evil places of power? Challenging. Do we think we can work with others who are different and be stronger for it? Again, sit down with these questions later and let Bithia's part in this story really speak to you about what that means. And then last up, we meet Moses' sister Miriam, who was watching, waiting, and ready. And she was ready to speak when the time was right. And she offers a clever solution. So preparation meeting opportunity is powerful. Preparation meeting opportunity in these climate days is powerful. She shows extraordinary courage, a young woman of character and trust in her mum. She could have seen Pharaoh's daughter with her wealth and her power, and she could have shrunk back. But instead, she steps towards power and to potential threat, which is what nonviolent direct action is always doing. Maybe Bithia would smell a rat, a definite risk for the whole family. So the deliverance of the next generation, unbeknownst to Miriam, lay on her shoulder, and she was up to the task. Imagine her looking back later and seeing her part in it. She saved her people. So when opportunity meets preparation, we have momentum and power to change things and move things forward. Again, sit with Miriam later and explore it for our time. She saw a partial story, but was compelled to act, and thank God she did. So all 5 women powerfully resisted in their own way, and they refused to take part in evil in their context. Resistance of evil is a holy act. Standing up for justice is a holy act. Making changes in our own lives that put sustainable living at the center is a holy act. So let's note in summary, all 5 women disobeyed orders from government and those in power directly over them. All lied to some degree. All took a deep breath and stepped forward and held their nerve, and all pleased God. And we in these climate days must face Shifra, Pua, Jochebed, Bithia, and Miriam in the eye and say we are doing all we can to protect the most vulnerable, even if we're not successful, because like them, we know it's the morally right thing to do. And even if we fail, Ruth Jarman, who set up Christian Climate Action, says this: even if we fail, we will go down with dignity, because dignity comes from acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly. There's no other way. So will we let the gospel be incarnate in our time? Now, today we've taken a deep dive into Exodus 1 and 2, a very brief 20-minute deep dive. I would love to come another time and do a deep dive into Huldah and Jonah and some others, if you'll have me. But I hope today has given you a little framework for when you have Christian conversations and people say there's no such thing as nonviolent direct action, you can go back to this narrative with these 5 women, this shape in your head, and show that resistance comes in many various forms that they've demonstrated. 3 books to recommend if you want to go deeper into these particular women, and nonviolent direct action in general. But Bodies on the Line is written by Sue Parfit, one of our members. This is not about these women, but it's a brilliant, brilliant book written by a lady in her 80s. But the next 2 books, this one, Defiant by Kelly, I can't say her name very well. Nikon Deha has written a superb, brilliant exploration of the women in Exodus and what they can teach us about freedom. That I would really recommend. And then Elaine Storkey, another wonderful women, 3 wonderful women actually, women in a patriarchal world. And this is a wonderful whistle-top tour of some of the wonderful women who are helping us learn about nonviolent direct action. So I heartily recommend those books to you. So I guess there's been lots to think about. I'm going to hand back now. I think we're going to have a pause. So I will be quiet now and hand back to whoever I'm handing back to.
Paul, if you could put Rachie's questions back up on the screen, maybe. And I think the idea is this is a comfort break for the next 2 or 3 minutes. People need to get up and stretch, go to the restroom, get a drink of water, and then we come back to Michael.
Excuse me, but Ms. Ross, could you say just the titles of those 3 books once again? I didn't have a pen before.
Yeah, I'm typing them actually in the chat box for you, if that helps. And I'm just giving you a little
Sure.
line after each one, Carol, just so you can make it, see what
Thank you.
takes your fancy. All right, no worries.
Thank you.
And the questions are now in the chat for people to copy.
There's the new message.
Mike, I think we're back over to you.
Lovely, thank you. It was really lovely hearing Rachie talking there. I first met Rachie several years ago up in Manchester, which is a city in the northern part of England, and met her in a church where she was taught. She did that talk, and it was a workshop on non-violent direct action. So it was lovely to be reminded of that time. We are, as we've been talking about, we are in the midst of an ecological crisis. We've got the threat of climate change, with temperatures on course for a devastating 3-degree rise by 2050. And we're also in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, where the future of life on Earth is in doubt. And governments, who I think all of us would agree, whose first duty is to protect the people they govern, and corporations around the world, have in many ways failed the world in their duty of leadership to respond to this unprecedented challenge. And I think there are many reasons for this failure. I think the first thing is just the sheer complexity of this wicked problem. I think the second thing is that we have a human tendency to want to ignore the signs of disaster and carry on with business as usual. And then, of course, there is self-interest, arrogance, lying, greed, and corruption. There are many, many brave Christians in the UK and around the world who have seen this moral failure of leadership to avert impending disaster. And after trying other means of campaigning, and after much prayer, have decided to take up non-violent direct action against their own governments and against fossil fuel companies, and for that matter, against a colluding church. And in doing so, they have based their actions on the life and the teachings of Christ. So what did Christ teach about the righteousness of non-violent direct action against oppression and injustice? I'm going to share a few thoughts. It's fair to say that Jesus didn't really leave us many clues as to how to deal with violence and injustice from others. He was usually talking to us about how to be peaceful, how to be compassionate to others. But we do, however, have 2 accounts from the Sermon on the Mount, one in Matthew 5 and the other in Luke 6, that describe what I would call Jesus's third and loving way. And it's the way of creative, loving, non-violent resistance. The only way to love your enemies, and it's the way to bring about the reign of God, his love and his peace into a world and personal lives. And I think in many ways the church over the centuries has preached passive behavior in the face of power, and worldly or church authority. And unfortunately, many church leaders have been seduced into a conspiracy of teaching that you should bear with abuse. It's taught that you should go the second mile, or, for example, endure a marriage that's killing your spirit. It's taught that you should tolerate abuse and turn the other cheek. And as a result, many sinful behaviors have been ignored, if not sanctioned, in the service of avoiding conflict and exposing abuse. I don't think Jesus taught peace at any price. I think God damns these misinterpretations. I think they defy our Hebrew vision of a God who protected the oppressed, the poor, the widows, and orphan children. How can we read Hebrew scriptures and still see Jesus saying that if somebody hits you, just turn the other cheek? So they hit you again, and then you have to hang in there in the face of abuse. my sense is that such an interpretation may have suited the patriarchal world of the past, because it could be used to support male power in families where abuse was prevalent. There is, though, I think, a much more reasonable interpretation that seems to be much more consistent with the other stories of Jesus's compassionate teachings. I don't think Jesus ever taught passivity in the face of evil. Jesus also never taught that violence is appropriate, as it is an appropriate response to evil. I think what makes much more sense is to find a meaning that meshes with all the other passages that call us to love our enemies and to do good to those that abuse us. You do no good by retaliating in a like manner, in a violent manner. You also do no good by fleeing and letting them think that they've won. You love your enemy when you show them how they're being unjust, and by giving them the opportunity to grow and to learn from that experience and to open their hearts to God's grace, to change their violent, their unjust and oppressive ways. And I think this goes back to the classic word repentance, which in Greek is metanoia. And metanoia means a change of heart, a change of mind, which I think is so much better translation of that word than repentance. So nothing can be assumed when you read the Bible. It contains the word of God, but you have to really dig it out for yourself and read it with your heart. You have to read between the lines and set the context in the set it in the context of the time, so that you hear what is being said, the way the writer meant it, and the way that listeners heard it. Let me demonstrate this by describing the social situation at the time when the Gospels were written, and what this word picture would have meant to those who heard it in the first place. So let's look at the first of the three directives from Jesus to those who would lead Jesus' third way of creating creative, loving, non-violent resistance. So here are the words recorded in various translations of the original Greek in Matthew 5:38-41. It needs to be read carefully, noticing the context and then thinking about the socio-political situation in which the hearers of these words were living. Matthew 5:38 says, "You have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles." These aren't directions to let people walk all over you. These aren't calls to be passive and to take whatever abuse oppressors want to place on you by the power over you. These are essentially guidelines from Jesus for non-violent resistance. You need to notice that they're not pleas for help from a less powerful person. They all involve someone with power over another, enough to strike, to sue, to force. So the first illustration Jesus gives is to turn the other cheek when someone hits you. This makes no sense. How does that help you, or how does it help the other? How is this loving? How is this just? But if we remember in Matthew says, Jesus said, turn the left cheek. That's interesting. Why the left cheek? Why such a specific direction? Turn the left cheek. Turn the other cheek, Matthew reads, if someone strikes you on the right cheek. Let's discover what that word picture would have meant to those who heard it in the first place. In first century Judea, it was occupied by the Romans and a ruling class of collaborators, Levite priests and aristocrats. And Jesus was largely ministering and preaching to the poor, and many of his listeners were actually slaves. And he would have seen how the ruling class didn't treat laborers and slaves as equals. They were often reprimanded with a slap to the back of the right hand to the right cheek. If you try this now, I'm not suggesting you hit each other, but if you were to try this now, you'd see how easy it is and how it feels. But to strike a peer, someone you're equal in Jewish society or Roman society, you would use your fist and you'd hit directly to the left cheek. Of course, this is all assuming you're actually right-handed rather than left-handed. For those who are left-handed, it would be reversed. So Jesus is directing us to turn the other cheek, to turn the left cheek. And what that is doing is actually forcing the hitter to hit you as an equal. It alerts the hitter to the fact that they are treating you as a lesser. And that forces them to recognize that they are abusing their power over you and to think about changing their behavior. This call to turn the left cheek meshes with everything else that we've been told by Jesus to do to build the kingdom of God, to show love for our neighbors, even when they abuse us, but also to show love by pointing out the unjust nature of their acts and giving them the chance to change their minds, to act more justly. But what does this have to do with loving that enemy that would strike us? I think that you love someone when you wish and work for the best for them. It's about tough love. You don't have to do what they want you to do, but you do have to do something for themselves. You help them discover their own resources. You help them discover what they may have been getting away with is neither going to work nor be tolerated in the same way. You're pointing out to them where they are abusing you. You're giving them an opportunity to learn, to change, and to grow. And that's a loving thing to do. To the enemies who wield power over you and abuse that power, you can demonstrate they do not have that power over you. They will have to treat you as an equal, as a child of God, not a slave. So I think we've probably misunderstood these directives from Jesus for centuries because we perhaps didn't read every word and place it in the social context of the day that it was spoken. Is this an isolated case? No, I don't think it is. So let's consider the other 2 points and see if they also fit into this pattern. So Matthew reads, if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. So what does this mean? So again, Jesus's world was a world of poor farmers, of wealthy land grabbers governed by Levitical law. Without a coat, any peasant would be without a covering at night. And it gets very cold in the hill country of Judea. And I know because I've been to Judea and I've camped out there. It is freezing at night. And getting chilled night after night weakens the body and it makes you susceptible to illness. Weakened, you might not be able to tend your crops. Your harvest might fail. So ultimately, the landlord can claim his land back and leave you destitute. So by voluntarily stripping, what you're doing is you're actually shaming the abuser. You're highlighting the extreme consequence of their abuse, and you shame the beholders, exposing the injustice to the public. So Jesus is directing us to give the rest of our clothing to the point where we're naked. And in Hebrew tradition, as I'm sure you'll all know, to behold nakedness is a shame on the viewer, not the naked. So there's that lovely story about when Noah was drunk and fell asleep. So his sons, Shem and Japheth, walked into his tent backwards and covered their father. There's a lovely example of this from the days of apartheid in South Africa, where South African soldiers went into a shanty town to bulldoze some shacks and some houses. And the women in the huts were told by the soldiers to come out, grab their positions before the houses were knocked down. The women seeing this and realizing what was about to happen then actually just stood in front of their homes and stripped themselves naked. And the effect this had on the Calvinist Afrikaner soldiers was to embarrass them in front of their colleagues, their fellow soldiers, and they walked away. They didn't bulldoze the houses. Now, if you look at the second example, going the second mile, Matthew says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. What does that mean? Well, as you said before, the Jews were under Roman occupation, and the authorities had agreed that it was permissible for Roman soldiers to ask local Jews, to conscript local Jews to carry their military backpacks for 1 mile only. Now, the Romans were pretty methodical, pretty organized. There were mile markers along major roads. We've still got some here in Britain, actually, although I haven't been forced by a Roman soldier to carry their packs recently, thank heavens. And any violation of this agreement, such as forcing somebody to walk beyond 1 mile, was actually punishable by military law. So by directing his followers to go a 2nd mile, what Jesus is doing is actually forcing the Roman soldiers to see that they're abusing their authority and not treating Jews as equals. And it's alerting his commanding officer that he's breaking military law, so he'll get into trouble. It's all very clever stuff, I think. So what Jesus was doing essentially was calling his followers and us now in the present day to point out how others are abusing their power and oppressing others, and oppressing the earth for that matter. When you point out the abuse, you open up to the oppressor the opportunity to learn, to change, and to grow. So there's a modern day example of non-violent direct action. And this is a story about an old man getting onto a train with a reserved seat ticket and finding that a younger man was sitting in his seat. And the older man asked him to move, but he refused in a very rude and dismissive way. Seeing this, another passenger nearby got up and offered his seat to the old man. And then, following his example, a second person did the same, and then a third. So these non-violent, loving, resistant actions shamed the younger man who'd refused to give up his seat, and eventually he also got up and left. In his actions, Jesus also followed these principles of love and non-violent direct action. So at his arrest, he healed the temple soldier's ear. At his trial, he stayed silent and refused to answer questions or vindicate himself, but instead asked his own questions and challenged the authority of the Sanhedrin, using tactics to reveal the injustice of his situation and to disconcert his enemies. At his crucifixion, he forgave his killers. Even his bodily resurrection broke the law. After being condemned to death by the emperor's representative, Pontius Pilate, coming back to life was, you could say, the ultimate insubordination. And there are other examples in the gospel of Jesus breaking the law of man in order to follow the law of God, and of love and of justice. And a really good example, I think, is the one that we refer to right at the very beginning of this session, Jesus cleansing the temple, referred to in Matthew 21, 12, 17. And as I inferred, Jesus did this because the high priests and money changers and those that sold pigeons and sheep for ritual sacrifice were charging the poor extortionate rates. The temple had been turned into a money-making enterprise that exploited and excluded the poor from worship. And this was done by the Kohanim, the rich aristocratic priestly elite collaborating with Roman oppressors. Final example I want to give before we just close this is in Mark 3, 1-6, when Jesus has gone into a synagogue on the Sabbath and is presented with a man whose hand was shriveled. And he asked the question, to the Pharisees who've gathered. And it's a brilliant, brilliant question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? A really powerful either or, very leading question, which places these enemies, the Pharisees, in a really difficult position. Now, Jesus could have said to him, look, I'll see you tomorrow when the Pharisees aren't around. Or if you sneak out the back, I'll see you behind the synagogue and I'll heal you there. But he doesn't do that. He heals. He decides to heal the man there and then in front of the authorities, the religious authorities. And what he's doing essentially, I think, is challenging a bigger injustice, the way that Jewish law was used to control and keep the poor down. So there is, I think, an incredibly strong case for using non-violent direct action to challenge government, to challenge corporations in the fight for climate justice, based on Christ's teachings and Christ's behavior. And I want to leave you with just three questions. The first is, would you ever consider non-violent direct action for the life of the earth? And in what circumstances? And the second question I would invite you to consider is, what would stop you from taking non-violent direct action? And my third question is, if you are actually contemplating taking non-violent direct action in defense of life on earth, what would you need to support you?
Thank you, Michael and Rachie, for very stimulating and compelling, stimulating our thoughts. This is now an opportunity for our participants to pose questions, and will perhaps also provide an opportunity to hear your thoughts and how you might answer the questions that both Rachie and Mike have posed. I've not seen actually really any questions in the chat. I've seen lots of comments, which I've sort of read as confirming or supporting the kinds of interpretations that we've heard from Rachie and Mike relative to our scriptural foundations. So I'm going to start by posing a question to either of you. You had said that people have in the UK, after many efforts by other means, have decided to take up nonviolent direct action. Can you talk a little bit about your experience of that threshold? At what point did you feel that efforts by other means were not sufficient, were not working, and that nonviolent direct action was the only avenue that was available to you, either of you?
Mike, you go first.
Okay. I think the environmental movement for the last 50 odd years has been making the point that we are in the process of destroying life on Earth, whether through climate change or through causing the extinction of other than human life. I think for me, what really tipped it was realizing that many conservationists, both in the UK, Europe, and in America, were despairing. Really, nothing was being done, and that corporations were actively lying. and that governments were, I think, Rachie was talking about George Monbiot earlier on. He's a marvelous journalist here in the UK. George Monbiot wrote a book several years ago called Captive State, where he argued that the British government is largely in cahoots with many corporates, unfortunately. And I think that's probably true of America as well, with the lobbying that's going on. I kind of felt that taking I mean, I've been arrested once and I plan to get arrested again. I felt that the only way to force the government to take action and corporations was to make it clear that people had had enough, and that they weren't listening to petitions, they weren't listening to letters, they weren't listening to polite little marches. We had 80,000 people on the streets of London the other month. None of that was reported in the press. But when we step out in front of a car and we stop the car and people get frustrated, then it's reported. I don't know whether that answers your question, Dean, but yeah.
Yep.
Rachie, sorry.
No, it just leads on really nicely from Mike's point. So Mike's talked about corporates. So being within the church, being an elder, having left the church because I preached on climate or one of my, and then they took my sermon down. Okay, so eventually I left the church. We've left the church for a while, and that's absolutely what we should be doing. But part of the reason why I felt it was a call of God on my life to be true to the non-violent God I have, to actually follow in this way, despite the outcome. I said that in the chat, not outcome based, is because it's the right thing to do. Now, for me, the call was, I work within the church within Operation Noah, getting to divest money out of fossil fuels, to be true to what they're saying, to have clean lips and dirty hands and all that kind of thing. I felt prophetically like the church is in bed with the state. In the UK, we have a church that's sitting so tightly in bed with the state that I had to get I was saying, where's the church? Why is the church behind on it? So I think for me, the Christian voice was silent in a sense, the church was silent, and hence found my breath within Christian Climate Action to go, oh my word, political and faith-based. So it became a divine space. So for me, it was an act of worship rather, and like Mike said, for all the reasons Mike said, but it was an act of worship to step out and step in to being a human being in this time. Yeah, I don't know if that's answered your question, Dean.
Yes, very much. I'm going to look for others who might want to comment or ask a question to raise their hand. And members of the team, please help me watch for that. You can raise your hand, with the reactions tool, and that'll move you to the head of the screen and make it easier to see you. But let me mention something and get your perspective on this. Our particular movement, of course, began in the early 19th century with a very charismatic leader who was viewed as a prophet and a spokesperson for God. More recently, in our movement, there's been an entreaty to shift our thinking away from a movement with a prophet to being a movement made up of prophetic people. And I think, for me at least, that empowers us to think about how we might ourselves act directly in response to a sense of injustice and the needs of the world to make a difference. Can you reflect on how you think that would fit into your way of framing the need to act on climate change in a nonviolent, direct way? Is that fair?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll jump in first and Mike can have a break and he can follow up with something profound. I think absolutely. I think the thing I view this, and I'm sure Mike agrees because we're both coaches, the levers we have are different. So you in your context have a different lever to me. And what I mean by that is a place where we've got greatest push, where I can lever something. So as a church leader, I have leverage in the church. Okay. You guys have leverage in your churches. But that prophetic calling of a people, I mean, yeah, it's scanning the horizon, it's listening for the drumbeat of God in our lives, but it's also watching for the drumbeat of God in the world and listening to where it's died in the decisions that are being made. So you're absolutely right. Releasing that, I think, to the people with that great kind of heritage you've inherited, like you said, from the prophetic, is absolutely crucial. Because I think what I see, and again, Mike will maybe comment on this as well. I've been involved in quite a lot of direct actions. I was part of an action which broke two church services up in our St Paul's Cathedral, which is the biggest cathedral in the centre of London, and Southwark Cathedral. And there are times when actions feel prophetic. You think it's the right time, it's the right way, it's the right creativity, it's got the breath of God. And then you see actions that you think, that didn't feel prophetic. That felt humanly a bit clunky. But again, the outcome, in a sense, isn't where we're sitting. We're saying we're trying to be obedient. And this is the challenge, to be prophetic and priestly and creative. We need prophets, priests, pilgrims, and artists. We need all of them. But to keep that prophetic alive, if we're not careful, otherwise we end up doing the things in our own strength, which can be clunky and do damage. So it's that constant group and listening, group, listening. And I think that's why we're better in a group, to be honest. That's why I think we can, protect each other from that. Anything you want to add to that, Mike, I'm sure?
I think what you're describing there, Dean, is really important. I think one of the things I notice in some Christian churches, not all, but in some, is that in calling Christ God, we can project all our goodness onto him in worship, and then fail to follow him. So psychologists would talk about the dark shadow and the light shadow, and we're projecting all our goodness onto Christ, rather than actually we're being called to be like him. So I think it's very healthy to flatten the hierarchy, flatten structures, and call everybody to prophecy, everybody to action. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think there's when we raise people up as prophets, sometimes that gives us an excuse just to follow them and not do anything, just to be passive and not recognize the great leadership qualities that we have within ourselves, I think. So I think it sounds a very healthy trend you're talking about.
I'm going to pose your questions back to our participants.
Michael has a question.
Oh, Michael?
Yeah, I had that Mike's comment just triggered a thought that I had from an earlier comment he made about the 80,000 in the protest march that didn't make headlines. What if that 80,000 had been 500,000, or what if that 500,000 had been 2 million? Yeah, it's getting the word out. It's getting people to understand what's happening. It's educating, basically. I still believe that people in general will do the right thing if they're educated, if they know what the right thing is. And what would the situation be like with our government if the majority of the people realized where the problems were?
Can I just speak back to that, Michael?
Can I?
Oh, go.
Just a quick one to you. I agree, Mike. I'm not too sure that education is the issue, though. I think most people now know. Well, certainly in the UK, I don't know about the States. I think most people now know in the UK how serious this situation is. I think I don't think human beings are wholly rational. I don't think more information will necessarily get people out on the streets. I think we're a herd animal, and it's when we see others doing it, when others are behaving and living differently, that people will change. So I think it's behavior that changes other people, not more education, more information. I think people, certainly in the UK, have got more than enough information. How we change behavior, I don't know. That's a real, still working on that one.
This is why, just to add to this is why it's so exciting that the churches, the Christians, us, we're having this conversation, because I think it's about this resistance to what I call the divine interruption. None of us want to be interrupted as from business as usual. You know, I'm having a phone call and I'm having a cup of tea and the phone goes. I don't want to be interrupted. That's just something pathetic. When you look at the kind of the institutional shift, this divine interruption is resisted at all turns. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine knows, he was in the cathedral where it was the church was broken up recently. And he said this, he said, I agree with everything that you're doing, but I don't agree with your methods. And it's like, well, if you agreed with everything we were talking about, you would agree with the methods. They know the information, but they don't want this divine interruption. And I think there's something about that's part of the human nature, like Mike said. I think you're also right there, Mike. We need the numbers. We do need numbers because numbers speak, tragically. So there's a lot about Palestine, that the numbers on the streets are thankfully reflective of the fact that people have got feelings, but you can't get that for climate because it's an existential, outside of us problem. So it's a wicked problem. It's this thing, isn't it? It's like a toddler with chocolate fingers. They touch everything, you can't see the toddler, you just see the marks of it. So yeah, very good point. Oh, something in the chat there.
Yeah, Michael Clark also had his hand up.
He's muted.
Yeah, I've just turned my mute off. I'm a member of Community of Christ and a member of Christian Climate Action as well. And in our enduring principles, we have the sacredness of creation. And that's helped me in a way to become a non-violent protester. I wouldn't like to get arrested because I don't work and they'd probably stop all my benefits and stuff if I did. But like Andrew said, we can work together with helping the arrestee people. The first march I went on was from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Square. And there was all different faiths working together. It was amazing, that walk, going into Westminster Square, meeting up. Well, there was about 300 Christian Climate Action members from different faiths, meeting up in the square with Extinction Rebellion. That's the action I could do. And I felt that God was leading me to do that. And I ask you to do that as well, if you care for our world.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone have a response to Michael's question? Would you ever consider nonviolent direct action for the earth? What would stop you? Or what support do you need? Anyone care to comment in our participant group? Please raise your hand so we can see you.
And remember from the 5 women that nonviolent direct action can look incredibly different in different contexts. Okay, so it's not pro forma and it's not one way fits all. So creative around what the Spirit of God is asking you to do. What would that look like in your context?
Mike Barnett.
Yeah, I'm back on the education thing. England or Great Britain might be a lot smarter than the United States. I still have lots of my family and friends that even though they hear things about climate change, they are non-believers. They don't trust what they hear. They listen to things that they see on the internet or Facebook or whatever. So education, from my perspective, where I live, maybe it's Florida, maybe it's not the United States, maybe it's just the state of Florida. But anyway, we're still struggling. And so my response to taking action for climate change is to help people to understand it.
I agree, Mike. Sorry, I agree, Mike. I think it's the sort of first step, but it's not enough. I think we have similar issues here in the UK, and I think a lot of that is due to I suppose in a sense we're living in a sort of post-truth society where the bigger the lie and the more lies you tell, you can attract attention. And we have a media that no longer, I think particularly in the US, you have a media that no longer is required by law to be objective and to be impartial. So those are real challenges to overcome. Unfortunately, being emotional, biased, and prejudiced is far more attractive and compelling than being scientific and telling the truth. And that's just the way. So it's a real tough one, isn't it? How do we overcome that? And that is affecting not just climate change, but it's affecting a whole range of other debates around politics in the US, in the UK, and the rest of the world. It's the wider fight for democracy, I think. Yeah,
I agree.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rachie. Do you have something?
I was just gonna speak to Laurie's question actually, which is
Yes.
is it Laurie?
Yes.
Just so Howard Thurman, I love his work, absolutely love it, and your point is so valid. I think I went to a really interesting talk recently. I'm part of Justopod as well. But what was interesting, they did this great little. This might help, it might not. They said, look at what violent means, what non-violent means, and then what not being violent means. And there are three distinct issues, and that middle one is really tricky. You go, I'm clear what violent means, potentially. Non-violent, I think I know what that means, but what is not being violent? And not being violent is that passivity. So there's something about non-violent direct action which is chosen, deliberate, prayerful, considered. And Howard Thurman's, decision to create communities when the snow melts, we have to have already planted seeds, right? Our communities need to be resilient. So this feeling of we have to do these, that is his non-violent direct action in a sense, because what he's doing is he's creating something underneath, which is very subversive. Communities are subversive, trust me. Why? That's why churches are so brilliant if they're healthy and functioning, aren't they? All ages, all nationalities, genders, and so on. But I think that third point about when it's just not being violent, just be careful it's not passive and it's not a non-considered decision to hold your stance. Because I look at Jochebed, who made a decision to go across that river and put her baby in the reeds. She didn't just let him go off down the river. That's not being violent. Does that help a little bit? Whoever Laurie is.
Yeah, that's me. And
hi, darling. Yes, hello.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's the difference between the kind of community that Howard Thurman created in San Francisco, which was still very progressive, and cross-racial, compared to the way the churches in Germany, what Bonhoeffer was reacting against in Germany, with the going along with it. I mean, there's a different, how to really think more deeply about all of these questions. It's a different than being passive. It's different than going along with. It's got an edge to it, but it's a chosen edge, a discerned edge, a perfectly understood edge. Because one of the other women you talked about chose from their what they had the ability to do, even if it was just this much, where we're limited. And
exactly.
Yeah, that does, those three, making that distinction about not being violent is not, we're not talking about being passive. That's very helpful.
And you mentioned Bonhoeffer, and again, I've just finished reading his letters from prison, and his that man did not know his life. We look with retrospect 80 years later. So I guess it's something around trying to go above and look down with God's eye view too, whatever that means, because God is here as well. But do you know what I mean? Trying to see our lives in the arc of where we sit, not just individually in our own lane, which I think can help.
Thank you.
So there's so much more I'm sure that we could talk about. Susan, you want to weigh in?
Oh, no. Are you trying to close it off? That's fine.
I was just going to hand it over to Joan for her closing. Yeah, but
that's fine.
So thank you all for engaging in this conversation, and please contemplate the questions that were posed. I'm sure that there will be more occasions where we can begin to talk about what are we able to do as a people, and With that, I'm going to turn it over to Joan.
Thanks, Dean. And I want to begin by adding my thanks to Mike and Rachie for your, first of all, for your willingness to be with us in the middle of the night, and for how awake you are in the middle of the night, but your really thought-provoking presentations and questions. And I want to thank also all of our participants for being willing to continue this journey towards climate action with us. So before we close for today, there are just a few other items that we'd like to draw your attention to. In December of 2022, a year ago yesterday, our webinar focused on how to have productive conversations with friends and family about climate change, especially during the gatherings that are a part of our holiday season. A major focus for that webinar was information provided by Christian climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe, and she has a webinar specifically on this subject to teach how to have effective conversations. So along with all previous webinars, the entire presentation is available to rewatch on our website, seaofchristclimatejustice.org, going to the Archive Videos tab. In Catherine's November newsletter, November of this year, she provided a short recap of the major points to remember that help engage people in positive conversations. Talking about climate is one of the most important things for us to do. It's a huge factor in raising awareness and highlighting the need for action, as well as the hope generated by so many positive steps already taken. Also in the November newsletter are links to national and regional information sources about the current state of local climate realities, forecasts, and needs. If you haven't done so, it's easy to subscribe to Catherine's monthly newsletter. Once you've done that, check out her recent archives for this great information. Susan has already mentioned some positive results from COP28, which continues this week. One aspect we want to highlight is the increasing interfaith component of this annual event. There is now a faith pavilion at it. And although unfortunately he had to cancel due to health issues, this was to have been the first time that a Catholic Pope was to attend and address the summit. Climate change is increasingly being seen by most faith movements as an imperative for their involvement. So where do we go from here in our journey of restoring right relationships through climate action? While caring for creation is a central part of faithful discipleship, none of us need to, or likely want to, do it alone. We're devoting 2 sessions in January to explore together with you what kind of support you need. Come bring your ideas for creating support groups and sustainability teams. There's power in doing things together. And while you're thinking about that, we want to hold up another part of our webinar from last December using Venn diagrams. It's human nature to be so overwhelmed by so much need and uncertainty and misinformation that it can be hard to do anything. In that webinar, Susan walked us through how to use a Venn diagram format to cut through that overwhelm and identify the next right step for you. By beginning with your skills and interests, and then looking to what brings you joy before adding in what needs are most urgent in your awareness, it can be easier to identify a few steps uniquely suited for you at this time. So while you're watching that refresher on how to have conversations, give some thought to your own Venn diagram so that you can come to the January webinars with more clarity. This concludes the session for today. Thank you for joining us on this amazing journey, and we hope to see all of you on January 7th, same time, same place. And so feel free now to unmute yourself and say your goodbyes.